let me just get this out of the way. Most of you watching this right now, you probably don't need me to tell you how great The Secret of Monkey Island is. You're well aware of how awesome it is. If you were into PC gaming in the early to mid 90s, chances are you probably played The Secret of Monkey Island. But I figured, what with the recent shutdown of LucasArts, what better way to celebrate the company than to talk about, arguably, the greatest game the company released. Now, unlike my experience, or lack of experience, with The Adventures of Willy Beamish, I played a ton of The Secret of Monkey Island growing up. I played it primarily at my cousin's house. They had a PC before I did, at least a year or two before my family did. And they got a copy of the game, and actually it was a compilation. It's called LucasArts Classic Adventure Compilation, I think it was called, that they received from a family friend of theirs. I had Loom, I had Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I think that's all of them. Anyway, it was awesome. It was my first experience with those games, and it was just my mind was blown. It was really my first experience with point-and-click adventures, the genre as a whole. So Monkey Island for me is the standard by which I set all point-and-click adventures. Now, going back to my Willy Beamish review and how I talked about my birthday in 1995 when I got the Sega CD and a few games, well, one of the games that I got besides Willy Beamish was The Secret of Monkey Island, because I was such a huge fan of the PC version. Of course, this isn't actually the copy that I got back then, because as I mentioned, I returned all those back to Babbage's. This is another one that I just picked up relatively recently, actually on an eBay auction with Wonder Dog. The game's actually pretty good. But anyway, now as I mentioned at the beginning, owing to the fact that most of you probably know all about The Secret of Monkey Island, I'm not going to spend much time actually going on about the history or the story. That's been covered in other videos. You can look those up on YouTube or number of websites. I'm just going to talk about the Sega CD version, because not too many people probably talk about the Sega CD version because, well, it's again, it's a console version of a point-and-click adventure game, and as I mentioned in the Willy Beamish video, point-and-click adventure games for the most part should just be played on PCs. I'm going to focus more on how the Sega CD port compares to the original PC releases, which admittedly, it's been about 15 years or so since I've played, so my memory might be a little fuzzy, but in talking about the Sega CD port, I convinced at least one person who hasn't played the game to pick it up however they can, then this video has been a success. The Secret of Monkey Island, much like The Adventures of Willy Beamish, was originally released in 1990 on Amiga, DOS, Mac, and other platforms. The game was created and developed by Ron Gilbert, Tim Schafer, and Dave Grossman, all of whom continue to work in the industry and have reputations for developing quality titles. The Secret of Monkey Island is LucasArts' greatest masterpiece, and is the quintessential point-and-click adventure. When I think of PC gaming, the first thing that pops up in my mind is The Secret of Monkey Island. The story focuses on Guybrush Threepwood, a spindly young buccaneer, as the manual describes him, newly arrived on Melee Island with the purpose of making a name for himself and becoming a fearsome pirate. The first part of the quest involves the 3 initiation tests that are a rite of passage for any aspiring swashbuckler. Over the course of his journey, Guybrush is informed of the menace of the ghost pirate LeChuck and his ghastly crew. And not surprisingly, Guybrush crosses paths with the supernatural scourge later in the game. But that's all I'm going to say about that. The Secret of Monkey Island should be played going in as spoiler-free as possible. For those who haven't played it before, the experience will be all the more enriching if you go in with a clean slate, knowing as little as possible what lies ahead. For those who have played the game before, I won't waste your time bogging down this video with plot points that are ingrained into your gaming DNA. The Sega CD version was released in 1992, and unlike The Adventures of Willy Beamish, the console adaptation remains largely true to the style of the DOS release I played all those years back. There's no animated cutscenes, no spoken dialogue, and though the D-pad is again used to control the cursor, it never becomes a nuisance like it became near the end of Willy Beamish. For the most part, the game looks and feels exactly like it would if you played it on a computer. Even though the Sega CD was capable of full motion video, LucasFilm Games, as the company went by back then, chose not to tinker with perfection and stuck with an interface, sprite design, and music very similar to the computer versions, and I applaud them heavily for this. The game's signature wit and humor is kept intact. They even included the pirate who advertised the then upcoming Loom, even though the game was never brought over to the Genesis add-on. As mentioned previously, like the Adventures of Willy Beamish, the use of the mouse had to be adapted to the 3-button Genesis controller. The D-pad again moves the cursor, and the C button skips over dialogue lines, which is handy if you encounter the same cutscenes and want to hurry on with the game. The manual differentiates the A and B buttons, but in my experience, the tasks that are stated to be accomplished with the B button, such as choosing a dialogue option or examining an item, can be just as easily performed with the A button, and most of the time that's the only button I used. Going from Willy Beamish to this is like night and day. Willy Beamish needed the use of a mouse because it fits in the category of Sierra games where if you make one false move, you'll have to start from the last save point. Factor in the CD load times, and you have a gameplay experience that becomes very aggravating as you get stuck in a death loop. The Secret of Monkey Island, on the other hand, has a more laid-back approach. The developers wanted the player to explore the world and have a fun time doing so, without the pressure of timed action sequences. The control scheme works perfectly for this port, and other than aesthetic value, I don't see how the use of a Sega CD mouse peripheral, if it was available in the States, would have improved the experience. I may be giving off the impression that this is a pitch-perfect translation of one of the best, if not the best, point-and-click adventure games of all time, but there are some blemishes that mar the otherwise flawless work of art. Let's start with the music, or lack of it as it were. Don't get me wrong, I love the soundtrack, and a number of these songs have stuck with me from my youth into adulthood. But the problem is that long stretches of the game go by where the soundtrack is completely sparse, minus a sound effect here or there. I could be wrong about this, but I don't remember the DOS version being this quiet. Remember how I said in the Willy Beamish video about wanting to listen to music or a podcast at certain parts? This game almost requires it, but for completely different reasons. It really sticks out like a sore thumb every time it happens. What also sticks out like a sore thumb is the chronic occurrences of slowdown, very uncharacteristic of the Sega CD, especially for a game that comes nowhere near taxing the limit of what it can handle. Fortunately, it doesn't break the game or make it unwinnable. Not going into spoilers, but the end sequence was where I encountered the most slowdown. I thought that the game was going to freeze as it kept stuttering with every action I took. I wouldn't want to even imagine if Willy Beamish had a problem like this. Word of warning. I know I said I was going to keep this video spoiler free, but in talking about this next difference between the Sega CD version and the PC version, I actually have to address a pretty big spoiler that comes into play near the later part of the game. So if you haven't played The Secret of Monkey Island, I'm going to put an annotation somewhere on the screen that will have a skip point that'll take you right past this section. So if, like I said, if you don't want to find out about this, just click this and it'll completely bypass this section. You can come back to it if you want after you played the game, but for right now, just click the button. One of the areas where this game differs from Sierra titles is that, no matter what action you take, Guybrush cannot be killed, with one exception. After Guybrush has taken the idol from the governor's mansion, Fester Shinetop, who is of course LeChuck in disguise, catches Guybrush, ties the idol to his leg, and kicks it into the water, with Guybrush in tow. As mentioned in his conversation with the important-looking pirates, Guybrush can hold his breath for 10 minutes, and unless you do what you're supposed to do to progress, 10 minutes will pass in real time as Guybrush gets increasingly bluer in the face from lack of oxygen. At this point in the computer versions, Guybrush will turn green and croak, giving the player the options of decompose and bloat, among others. When I got to this part in the Sega CD version, I waited out the time limit and planned to do it over again properly the second time. Unfortunately, LucasArts changed this in the Sega CD version so that Guybrush can't die. When it gets near his demise, the game autoplays itself, saving the would-be pirate and sets him out on the grand adventure he was looking for. Very lame, LucasArts. The scene isn't graphic, so it's not like any kiddies would have gotten nightmares from the sight of Guybrush's pixelated bobbing corpse. At least this is made up for by the altered closing credits flashing screen of "Turn your Sega off and go to sleep," in place of the traditional "Turn your computer off and go to sleep." Spoilers off. The last major flaw is the use of a password system instead of saving to keep track of progress over multiple play sessions. The problem with this is that passwords are only issued after the completion of certain key events. This is made worse by the fact that the passwords don't keep track of all the items and actions chosen during a playthrough. Items like the hunk of meat and the scumbar kitchen will most likely have to be picked up again when using a password to start the game from a later point. This also means that dialogue scenes will be encountered again, so get ready to hit the C button repeatedly. Regardless of these nitpicks, the Sega CD version of The Secret of Monkey Island still retains that magic feel that set the game apart from its peers, and is fit to be classified among the good console port point-and-click adventure category. If you haven't played it, it's imperative that you get a hold of a copy however you can. A special edition of the game was released a few years ago on a variety of platforms, including mobile devices, Xbox Live Arcade, and the PlayStation Network. For those who have already taken the trip to Melee Island, play it again for old time's sake, and relive the memories of afternoons spent clashing steel and trading insults with fellow low-life grog-swilling pirate scum. Speaking of which, grab some of the signature concoction, or a safer alternative that won't melt your internal organs, and lift your mug in memory of LucasArts. Sure, they haven't given us many gems in recent years, but let's celebrate them for the legacy they've left behind and the many treasured masterpieces that will still be played for many years to come. Always remember, I am rubber, you are glue. Cheers.